This is the third and final part of taking you through making my dress suit based on Sebastian Michaelis from Black Butler. The canon version, at least. At the end, I'll finally show wearing the whole thing, but this part will be some tailcoat specific finishing as well as dinner trousers and at least a little on the waistcoat. There are other detailed guides for making things like the braceback trousers or the button flies, as well as much more general guides for making jackets, trousers, and waistcoats. Although the methods in those guides aren't the same as the ones I'm using now. In the future, those will be updated with the better methods that I know now, and I would be excited to share the methods I know of making, or the methods I know now of making more traditional morning coats. There are so many ways of doing things, as well as things that I never even would have thought of, and I'm sure that's a sentiment shared by many. I sense it's pretty easy to make a coat that looks like a good body coat. I think the trick is making an authentic one. And essentially, what I've done is make a body coat that looks like a body coat. I've made something that looks like a tailcoat. As it is, this is my non-traditional dress suit. I have the waistcoat lapel pattern that was used to chalk the outline onto the waistcoat in the second fitting. I trace the shape onto the wrong side of the satin that I'm using. I place it right side to right side with some lining that I'll use to bag it out. I baste along the curve of the lapel because that is the part that will be machined, using the baste as a guide to chalk the shape onto the lining because that will be on top as I put it through the machine, similar to the technique for making flaps for varied pockets. Trimming off the seam allowance past the machining, leaving the inlay where it goes over the front edge, bagging out the lapel, the edge needs to be basted to hide the lining behind the seam. When it's basted, the edge should be pressed, but it is very important that the stitching is not pressed, otherwise it will leave a mark on the satin that will not come out. I somewhat strategically baste a little further from the edge than I would usually in order to give myself some space in order to press the edge properly. Before the facing is put on, the lapel is positioned onto the front of the waistcoat and loosely basted in place. Adding the facing, there's nothing really new from here. Funnily enough, about 3 days after finishing this waistcoat, I had to do a waistcoat alteration, coincidentally for the same lawyer that I mentioned before. Essentially, the method of making the waistcoat was a lot better than what I did here. Therefore, I took this waistcoat apart and made it again, but better. I'll have to get around to making that new guide soon as well. Now then, I mark the top and bottom buttons and then find the 4 in between. The buttonholes on the left-hand side. I only mark the top hole in its entirety, but the front is half an inch or 1.2 centimeters from the edge, and then it's 5/8 or 1.5 centimeters wide. Lining the left and right hand side fronts up together, I can mark the height of the buttons on at the exact same heights of the buttonholes. At the button levels, I make my point. I measure half an inch and then another centimeter. So in total, I measure 2.2 centimeters or 7/8 of an inch from the edge of the waistcoat, which is where the buttons will be sewn onto. I just make a start removing some of the basting stitches and top pressing ahead of sewing the buttons and buttonholes, which I get up to off screen. Straight from having tried on the trousers, I want to experiment with adding the pockets without fully tearing down the baste. Importantly, the trousers have been trimmed already. I have the pocket bags and the facings. The basting stitches are largely removed as would be normal, undoing some of the waistband at the side seam and some of the side seam itself. I have a mark that tells me where the bottom of the pocket needs to be, so I take out the side seam to a bit below that point. Normally, the baste would be made with a much wider stitch than the finish. So, if it was planned not to take the entire trouser apart, half the seam would have to be sewn with a narrower stitch, and the parts that would need to be removed should be sewn with a wider stitch length. Then, here the whole wider stitch would be unpicked to be replaced when the side seam is sewn back up. This is potentially a little easier for me because the trousers have inseam pockets, thereby there is one fewer step at least than if I were doing this with side slanted pockets. I had to remove the overlocking above the notch, so that was just cutting the threads and pulling out the lead thread. I was absolutely not about to hand sew the braid onto the trouser this time. I learned how to machine it, which I expected would be more difficult than it was, because when hand stitching it, on both sides they need to be sewn concurrently. You have 2 threads and 2 needles, and sew about 15 centimeters or 6 inches on each side alternatively. This might seem a bit out of order, but I added the pockets and then I had to unpick the seat and inseam in order to add the braid properly. I spoke to 2 people about machining the braid onto dinner trousers, and both felt the need to specify that it had to be done before the inseam is sewn. These trousers have a grown-on brace back, so I start with sewing it starting from the raw edge of the cloth. At the top of the trouser, the braid needs to be fully on the underside of the trouser, but I keep it very close to the side seam. The pocket bag, importantly, has to be moved out of the way so that it does not get caught in the stitching. To baste it down to the side seam, the braid needs to be very net with the cloth. It is very important that there isn't any excess cloth or any excess braid between each stitch. The braid cannot be pulled tight or eased into the cloth. It is very important that the braid exactly matches the cloth. The stitch needs to be perpendicular to the direction of the braid. This holds it much more firmly as it's being put through the sewing machine rather than a baste that was just going in the same direction. Looking back, I can see very clearly that I am pulling the braid over the cloth by just a very small amount, but still too much. I treat it a little too much like canvassing. The trouser should be placed very flat onto a surface, and then the braid should just be placed onto the trouser. Below the pocket, the braid begins to cross the side seam such that down the rest of the leg, the front of the braid goes about an eighth over the seam. The braid gradually crosses the side seam along the 20 centimeters or 8 inches below the bottom of the pocket so that it doesn't just suddenly jump or bend across the seam. Therefore, from this point on, I need to look underneath the braid before almost every stitch in order to properly position it over the side seam. With the braid basted on, it should not be ironed at all because the stitching will make impressions on the silk and those impressions will not come out, similar to the satin lapels. Therefore, it is important that the side seam needs to be very well pressed before beginning to add the braid. This only really applies to satin or grosgrain braids. I don't expect you'd have the same issue with a ribbed braid. Ironing the side seam beforehand very well will also help it to lay very flat to place the braid onto it, just making this step easier. In trousers with normal waistbands, the braid might be added before the waistband and the braid goes into the seam, or it can go on after the waistband has been sewn and go over the top of the edge of the waistband. Tips I got for machining the braid on were to use a finer thread, a finer needle, and a narrower stitch length. So I switched to all of those. I also did change the thread in the bobbin, though I can't say whether that has a huge effect. As long as the braid was basted on properly, the machining should be quite easy. It's just following the very edge of the ribbon, which just depends on how well you can use the sewing machine. Obviously, I slipped off the ribbon a couple of times for a few centimeters. If I were going to fix that, I'd have to remove the entire line of stitching. It wasn't so bad, and they're only my trousers, so I just left it and continued the stitch. Past the pocket where the ribbon is being sewn onto, basically a flat surface, it's really easy to stitch quite quickly, which is a far cry from the 3 hours I spent when I was hand sewing the braid onto my previous trousers. Since the braid is completely flat and there is no excess trapped between each basting stitch, there is no cloth that can even be pushed to cause any sort of pulling, folding, or kinks. Similarly, there is almost no excess in the cloth underneath that can get caught between the bastes. Until I got to the bottom, the braid was pulled and basted slightly too tightly over the trouser. The excess is relatively obvious by the cloth waving underneath the ribbon. It was just at the bottom, so I was able to loosen the basting stitches that are holding the cloth tight into the ribbon. This allowed me to pull the excess of the trouser cloth under the ribbon and finish the first stitch. This is my first machined trouser braid besides a 30cm practice run. Looking back, it is quite clear to me that there was some excess trouser cloth under the braid, which is largely a problem because the braid has absolutely no give. No amount of stretch at all, and all the way down the leg, it is slightly shortening the outleg of the trouser. Not enough to cause any obvious kinks or pleats in the machine stitching, but enough that it shortens the seams where it goes into the braid. I think it was enough to see just one braid under the machine, so I take them back to the board. First thing to take care of is removing the basting so that I avoid accidentally ironing and creating impressions on the silk. At this moment, from the inside, there is an obvious excess trapped in the stitching down the outleg. After removing the basting, I try to press the cloth to shrink it into the stitching and make it a little less obvious. Otherwise, the braid has been added and the remainder of the trouser can be finished. Usually this would mean sewing on the waistband, because I think it's much better to have the braid sewn into the seam instead of over a separate waistband, but with grown-on brace backs, it's the inseam next, and there are separate guides for the backs. If I just skip to the end where the trousers are now finished and illustrate how important it is that the braid is not tight over the side seam, rippling all the way down. What is equally important is not to go the other way and make the braid long over the trouser, because then it'll just be the braid, possibly rippling, and not at all neat either. Having worn these a few times now, not because I have fun events to go to, but just because I felt like wearing them, I still don't totally like the buttonfly, and I don't really understand how somebody can like it. It's fine if you do, I just don't personally understand it. I think jeans are a different matter because denim is much sturdier, and it functions better than a worsted wool buttonfly. Around the time of initially putting the buttons on, I was being very lazy about sewing buttons and just haphazardly doing them. Surprising no one, then they came loose and began falling off, so that marks the end of not putting buttons on properly. In a similar sense, the buttons on a buttonfly should be sewn very firmly with almost no shank. This just makes them easier to use. I took this opportunity to try something where I make a tack just in the middle of the buttonfly instead of a tack between each buttonhole. I don't notice much difference in how it wound up working, but the buttons being sewn on properly definitely made them nicer to wear. First thing I want to show for finishing the jacket is sewing the lining down the back of the tails. This is where the pocket is, and I fastened the thread just below the lining along the hem of the jacket body. I start with a felling stitch, making just a few stitches before fastening the stitch and prick stitching into the lining just enough to the point that the cilicia of the pocket is folded. Holding the pocket opening, I prick stitch the lining and cilicia together to finish the edge. At the base of the pocket, place the pocket opening flat again and stitch to the fold of the lining, tacking that area a small amount to continue felling the tails lining onto the bottom back lining. I fasten and cut the thread at the bottom, and I will fell stitch the edge of the tails and the hem separately for this. No specific reason, this is just what I happened to decide at the time. I can't say for sure whether there are specific and laid out ways of making the pockets in the tails. This wasn't the same way as it was made in my old tailcoat, but I could say that my method here is neater than that one. I sense that it's a matter of doing it however it is that you can do it. For some reason, I have inserted sewing a clip of the side seam, probably to show the method I sort of remembered for sewing the seam. Having your finger in between one of the bastes in the seam to hold the cloth from the back, which makes it easier to not sew the seam into whatever's behind it. Prick stitching the edge of the tails overall was faster than I expected it to be. Similarly, hand stitching the patrol seams only took about 15 minutes each. Prick stitching the edge is the same as prick stitching the front edge. After that, the lining has to be felled along the edge of the tails as well. This might have been more difficult if there wasn't linen tape in the edge. It made the edges more firm and slightly thicker, which meant that it wasn't easy to sew through the tails, causing the fell stitch to show on the outside of the cloth, which is not something I wanted to happen. Basically, this was easy. I dedicated some time to showing this because I want to show how I am positioned with the tails on my knee, which is propped up on my other leg. I'm not leaning over it, rather I am sat back. Usually on film I have to be leant over my table to make it easier to show, but this is how I prefer to be sitting when doing finishing stitches. Basically, with the stitches on the tails done and the side seam lining also sewn, the tailcoat specific finishing ends with the hem of the body lining. Nothing that isn't very intuitive. While I'm here, I can take out some of the basting that I don't want anymore. In the tail's pockets, I also still have some basting thread that was holding it onto the tail before it was finished and should be removed. If it was potentially done correctly, then the baste can be removed from the outside of the tails, but as well, if the tails were made with canvas and the pocket was basted onto the canvas, then the baste could just be left because it has no ramifications at all. I swear my tailcoat still has some basting stitches in there. Clipping the side seam basting away from the armhole so that it doesn't get stuck under there after the armhole lining is sewn on. Prick stitching the front edge properly for the first time in a long while in my case. Given the specific vision I had for this jacket, I just decide by eye where the buttons should go. Sort of placing them nearly randomly to see if I can match about where Yana drew them. In some ways starting with the top and bottom ones and finding where the in-between ones should be. It was a benefit of me to mark stitch the out breast pocket and having left the mark stitches there to this point. It gave me a reference for where the pocket is. For some reason, I started laying the buttons onto the right-hand side. But it also gives me an additional reference for getting them in the same position on both fronts. Not that I used it as a reference at all anyway. Interestingly enough, in the books I read, the tailoring books, a tailcoat can historically have 3 or 4 buttons on the cuff. In all of the reference drawings I've looked at, except a horrifying AI-generated image of Sebastian, he has a 3-button cuff, which, as stated, is objectively accurate and historical. To me, there is a contemporary informality to the 3 buttons, where 4 is very normal, so this was a matter of slightly non-canonical taste. After sufficient pressing, the basting down the tails can be removed. The way I do it, there will be 2 bastes down the fold of the pleat, one from the outside and one from the inside. The mark stitches will also have to be removed, which I find to be the genius of the specific use of seams with and without seam allowance. The mark stitches or basting aren't caught in a seam and can be removed very easily. At the corner of the tails, the last 2 buttons are placed on, in no specific way. They are mostly there for decoration at this point. The baste in the sleeves I'm removing was an alternative method of positioning the lining into the sleeve. I might just need more practice with this method, but I otherwise don't like it very much. With this method, the sleeve lining is attached to the jacket at the armhole and the cuff. The lining is otherwise free inside of the sleeve. My usual method, the seams of the lining are basted to the seams of the sleeve. Removing a lot of the basting stitches, I need to leave the centre back baste in there before I take it away to top press. This just keeps the back lining pleat closed and it prevents it from moving around, causing a crease to be placed somewhere in the lining that I didn't want it. I should have potentially left one or both of the bastes in the tails holding the pleat into the back. It's already creased though, and it doesn't readily open, so it didn't go badly. And it just needs the finishing touch.
Sebastian, これをお返しします。これはファントム5伯爵の執事である証。今あるべきはあなたの胸の上だけです。
I don't know what to make of having finished. Oddly enough, I finished it the first time. By coincidence, a coat maker helped me with a top collar and at the same time fixed some shoulder issues that I barely realised I had. So I went back to this jacket and fixed the same issue, and, well, now it's, almost finished for the second time. I just about did not complete this through February 25, which was soon enough to wear it to the Golden Shears Awards, where one told me it was like I had a double submission. I also would have worn it to MCM London that time, but there were other things to do. As of yet, I've not worn it out anywhere otherwise, except to, Regent's Park as of publish. Also, I've noticed that I have some obsession with shortening the back, where I just kept doing it because I thought it was what the given jacket needed. The vent sits closed now, but I think there were other things I could have done before that to fix it as well. The armhole is sitting very, very high. I learned a lot doing this. Like I alluded, I didn't have much to go on with making. I'd been vaguely taught how to pattern bodycoats, but as equally illustrated, I didn't understand that all the way either. Knowing now how it's made helps with cutting the cloth, but making alterations is still something that I need to learn more on, like fitting alterations. Also adding quilting to the lining. I'm happy with how it turned out, and I'd enjoy making another bodycoat. Morning coat and especially frock coats have very minor differences in how they're made that certainly merit going over. I sure hope you were able to learn as much as I did making this, and that you'll join me for the next foray into such a project.